World-renowned linguist Alastair Finch, a man whose voice could command silence in auditoriums across the globe, pointed a dismissive, manicured finger at the maid's daughter and declared, with theatrical cruelty, "Perhaps the girl can enlighten us." A wave of uncomfortable laughter rippled through the opulent, mahogany-scented library. 10-year-old Alara stood frozen near the doorway, a ghost in a simple cotton dress amidst a sea of silk and cashmere. She had only slipped in to tell her mother, Maria, that her cleaning duties were finished for the night. Now she was the centerpiece of a rich man's jest. On a velvet-draped pedestal before Finch rested the Velis manuscript, a codex of inscrutable symbols that had baffled his entire team of PhD-laden researchers for months. Finch, enjoying the spotlight, continued his performance. "My esteemed colleagues and I have been humbled by this particular passage." He gestured to a line of elegant, thorny script. "But perhaps a fresh perspective is needed. One untainted by, shall we say, formal education." The barb was aimed not just at Alara, but at her mother, who stood mortified by the service entrance, her hands twisting a cleaning rag into a knot. Her face, usually a mask of professional invisibility, was pale with terror. "Come now, child," Finch cooed, his voice slick with condescension. "Don't be shy. Tell us what the ancients have to say." He believed the game was already won. The child would stammer, cry, or run away, proving his point about breeding and intellect, and his guests would be momentarily amused. He did not see the stillness in the girl's eyes, a depth that belied her age. He did not notice how her gaze wasn't one of confusion, but of quiet, intense concentration. Maria started forward, her voice a choked whisper. "Sir, please, she's just a child." "We'll go," but Alara didn't move. She took a small step forward, her worn shoes silent on the Persian rug. The laughter in the room died, replaced by a curious, expectant hush. The impossible challenge had been made. The trap was set. But no one, least of all Alastair Finch, could have predicted who was about to be caught in it. Alara's voice, when it came, was as soft as dust motes dancing in the library's lamplight, yet it carried across the suddenly silent room. "I can try." Maria's heart plummeted. She rushed to her daughter's side, her hand a frantic bird on Alara's shoulder. "No, Mija, no. We must go. Say you're sorry to the gentleman." But Alara stood her ground, her eyes fixed on the manuscript. It wasn't defiance that held her there, but a pull, a strange sense of familiarity with the alien script. It was a feeling she'd had before, looking at the faded pages of the books her mother kept in a locked trunk. Finch's eyebrows shot up in mock delight. "Marvelous. The girl has spirit." He clapped his hands together, a ringmaster celebrating his star attraction. "Let her approach. Let the prodigy have her moment," the crowd murmured, a mix of pity for the girl and morbid curiosity. They were connoisseurs of intellectual blood sport, and this promised to be a swift, if pathetic, execution. A woman in pearls whispered to her husband, "The poor thing. Finch can be so dreadfully cruel." Her husband shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's a lesson in humility, my dear." For the lower classes, Maria's pleading became more desperate. "Alara, listen to me. This is not a game. These are powerful people." Her words were a shield she was trying to form around her child, a shield she knew was pitifully thin. Alara looked up at her mother, her expression calm and certain. "It's okay, Mama. Great-grandpa always said, you don't fight the terrain, you read it." It was one of his cryptic sayings, nonsense to Maria, but to Alara, it was a fundamental law of the universe. The script on the page was not a wall to be broken, but terrain to be understood. With a gentle shrug of her mother's hand, she walked toward the pedestal, each step taking her further from the world of mops and buckets and deeper into the lion's den. The room held its breath, waiting for the child's folly to unfold. As Alara moved past him, Finch leaned down and caught Maria's arm, his grip surprisingly firm, his smile gone. The theatrical host vanished, replaced by a cold, precise tyrant. His voice was a low growl meant only for her. "Listen to me very carefully, Maria. Your daughter is about to make a spectacle of herself. When she does, and my guests have had their laugh, You will apologize for her impertinence. Maria nodded numbly, her throat tight with fear. But he wasn't finished. However, he added, his eyes like chips of ice, if this little charade becomes embarrassing for me, if she throws a tantrum, or wastes too much of my guest's time, or in any way detracts from the scholarly atmosphere I have cultivated, your employment here is terminated. Effective immediately, the threat landed with the force of a physical blow. This job was everything. It was their small apartment, the food on their table, the worn-out coat Alara wore in the winter. It was their entire fragile world. He saw the terror in her eyes and pressed his advantage. And I will personally see to it that you never work as a cleaner in this city again. I have friends in every household, on every board. You and your little genius will be on the street. Do you understand me? Maria's world shrank to the pressure of his fingers on her arm and the chilling finality in his tone. This wasn't a joke anymore. It was a warning. He was leveraging their poverty against them, ensuring his own victory no matter the outcome. If Alara failed, she was a fool. If she refused, her mother was jobless. He had constructed a perfect, cruel trap. He released her arm, the charming smile snapping back onto his face as he turned to the room. Let us give the young scholar our full attention. Maria could only stand paralyzed, watching her daughter, her small back so straight and vulnerable, as she approached the ancient book that now held the fate of their lives within its incomprehensible markings. Every beat of her heart was a prayer and a curse. Alara stood before the vellus manuscript. The air around the pedestal seemed different, heavy with the weight of centuries. The library's ambient noise faded away, leaving only the soft hum of the climate control and the whisper of vellum. The experts, Finch's hand-picked team of academics, stood nearby, arms crossed, their faces a mixture of smugness and boredom. They saw a maid's daughter about to make a fool of herself. Alara saw something else entirely. She didn't just look at the script, she observed it. Her great-grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, a low, patient rumble from a man she'd only known through stories and a single faded photograph. Don't just look at the letters, Ellie-Belle. See the space between them. That's where the truth hides. She leaned closer, ignoring the collective intake of breath from the onlookers who thought she might touch the priceless artifact. She didn't. Instead, she inhaled softly. The scent of ancient ink, of dried hide, of time itself. Every language has a smell, the voice in her head continued. It tells you where it's been. Was it in the desert? The jungle? A king's library? This one smelled of salt and dry earth. She then looked at the strokes of the letters. The experts saw impenetrable glyphs. Alara saw intention. She saw the slight tremor in a long, descending line, the confident hook at the end of a curve. These weren't machine-printed characters, they were drawn by a human hand. A tired hand, maybe. A hurried one. A man's handwriting is a map of his heart, Thomas Vance had written in his journal. Is he scared? Is he lying? Is he telling you goodbye? She traced a single character in the air with her finger, feeling its rhythm, its flow. The academics exchanged smirks. The girl was playing. But Alara wasn't playing. She was listening, not with her ears, but with an inherited instinct, a deep, cellular memory for the patterns of human expression. The silence stretched. Finch was about to call an end to the charade when Alara finally looked up, her gaze clear and direct. Where the salt burns the sky, she said, her voice steady. The shadow of the mountain drinks the last river. The silence in the room was no longer expectant. It was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket of astonishment. The translation was not the clumsy, literal guesswork they had anticipated. It was fluid, poetic, evocative. It sounded right. Finch's smile faltered, a crack in his polished facade. What? What did you say? He strode forward, snatching a printout of the passage from one of his researchers. The team had managed a few disjointed words: salt, mountain, river. They had assumed it was a geographic description, a simple declarative statement. But Alara's version was different. It was a lament. A warning. One of the academics, a Dr. Albright who had spent 6 weeks on this very line, stepped forward, his skepticism warring with a dawning awe. That's impossible. The syntax doesn't support that kind of allegorical interpretation. The root verbs are intransitive. Alara turned her calm gaze on him. You're thinking of High Velis, the court language. This isn't. This is Soldier's Velis, a Creole. They didn't use intransitive verbs the same way. The room stirred. Soldier's Velis? No such language was known to exist. Finch's face was darkening, his earlier amusement curdling into suspicion. And how, precisely, would a little girl like you know that? He demanded, his voice dripping with renewed scorn. Did you read it in one of your picture books? Alara shook her head, her expression unreadable. No, she said simply. They didn't write it in books. They carved it on the inside of their shields. The detail was so specific, so utterly out of place, that it stunned the experts into silence again. It was a piece of information that felt less like an academic theory and more like a lived memory. The turning point had been reached. The game was no longer Finch's to control. Alistair Finch, for the first time in his professional life, felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. The girl was not guessing. Her confidence was too quiet, too rooted. Nonsense, he sputtered, trying to regain command of the room. You're making this up. It's a clever parlor trick, but his own team was no longer looking at him. Their eyes were fixed on Alara, their academic curiosity overriding their loyalty to their patron. Dr. Albright pushed his glasses up his nose. The shield theory, it's unorthodox, but it would explain the inconsistencies in the script. The characters are etched, not written. The grammar is abbreviated, like a field cipher. He was speaking more to himself than to anyone else, his mind racing. Alara continued as if Finch hadn't spoken, her focus entirely on the manuscript. The language is a mix of a coastal dialect and a northern mountain tongue. The soldiers who wrote this were mercenaries, hired to defend a seaside kingdom from invaders who came from the mountains. They were losing. This isn't from a history book. It's a soldier's last letter home. She pointed to a series of smaller marks beneath the main line, marks everyone had dismissed as decorative flourishes. This isn't decoration. It's a name, written in the soldier's native dialect. His name was Kalen. The level of detail was staggering. She wasn't just translating words. She was excavating a life, a history, a forgotten tragedy from the fossilized ink. She was telling them the story behind the text, a story none of them had been equipped to even see, let alone read. The room was no longer a stage for Finch's ego. It had transformed into a lecture hall, and the 10-year-old daughter of the Maid was the one standing at the podium. Her simple truths were dismantling years of established academic assumption, one quiet sentence at a time. Finch's face was a mask of thunderous rage. His carefully curated evening, his moment of triumph in unveiling the manuscript, was being stolen by a child. He felt the eyes of his peers, his benefactors, on him. He felt their judgment. Enough, he roared, his voice cracking. This is preposterous. I will not have my life's work mocked by some fanciful tale from a little girl. Who taught you this nonsense? Who's been feeding you these lies? The accusation hung in the air, ugly and desperate. He was implying she was a pawn in someone else's game, a puppet sent to humiliate him. Maria flinched, expecting Alara to crumble under the force of his anger. But Alara simply met his furious gaze. She seemed to be waiting for that exact question. Her next move was slow and deliberate. She turned to her mother, who was still standing by the wall, a statue of fear. "Mama, may I have my satchel?" Maria, moving as if in a trance, retrieved the small, hand-stitched canvas bag Alara carried everywhere. With numb fingers, she handed it to her daughter. The room watched in baffled silence as Alara placed the bag on a small, empty table. She reached inside, her small hand searching. It did not emerge with a book or a cheat sheet. It came out holding two small, rectangular pieces of metal, strung on a tarnished chain. They were military dog tags. She held them up. They clinked softly in the silent room, a sound like distant, lonely bells. Then, she reached back into the satchel and drew out a small, leather-bound journal, its cover softened and darkened with age, the corners worn smooth. She laid it on the table next to the dog tags. The public humiliation was over. The private truth was about to be revealed. "My great-grandfather taught me," Alara said, her voice clear and resonant. His name was Sergeant Thomas Vance. She laid the dog tags flat on the table, a thumb brushing over the stamped letters of his name. The other linguists in his unit called him the Ghost Listener. He wasn't famous. He never wrote any books. He was a codebreaker in a war nobody remembers, stationed in a place most people couldn't find on a map. She looked from the faces in the crowd back to Finch, whose own face had gone unnaturally pale. He said the most important languages aren't the ones spoken by kings, but the ones whispered by soldiers in the dark. Because those are the ones that carry the truth about survival. She opened the worn journal. The pages were filled with a dense, precise script, interspersed with drawings of maps, plants, and symbols, rows and rows of symbols. She turned a few pages and then stopped, pushing the book forward. He never saw the Velis manuscript, but he met its descendants on the open page. Clear as day was a chart. On one side was a column of symbols from a known coastal dialect. On the other, a northern mountain tongue. And in the middle column, a hybrid script, the soldier's Velis. Below it, Sergeant Vance had written notes. A language of necessity, born of sand and rock, used for warnings, for last words. They carved it into things that would last: rock, leather, bone. Never paper. And there, at the bottom of the page, was the very sentence from the manuscript, perfectly rendered, with a translation scrawled beneath it: where the salt burns the sky, the shadow of the mountain drinks the last river. It was a soldier's poetic way of saying, the sea is to our backs, and the enemy is coming from the mountains. We are trapped, and we are going to die. The room was utterly still. Dr. Albright moved forward, his expression one of profound, reverent shock. He looked at the journal, then at the manuscript, then back at the journal. My God, he breathed. It's real. This is a primary source. This changes everything. The hushed whisper started, quickly growing into a wave of excited chatter. Academics crowded the table, peering at the journal with an intensity they had never shown the manuscript itself. They were witnessing the discovery of a new field of linguistics, not from a university press, but from a soldier's forgotten diary. Alastair Finch stood alone, a statue of crumbling pride. He was forgotten. The object of his obsession, the manuscript he had spent a fortune to acquire, was now just a footnote to the story of Sergeant Thomas Vance and his brilliant great-granddaughter. His public downfall was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, swift evaporation of his authority. He had built his reputation on being the man with all the answers, and a 10-year-old girl had just proven he hadn't even been asking the right questions. Amidst the academic fervor, a regal, elderly woman with kind eyes made her way to Maria. She was Eleanor Vance, no relation, a coincidence that felt like fate, the primary benefactor of the state university. Your daughter, she said, her voice warm, has a remarkable gift. And her great-grandfather was a hero. She looked from Maria's tear-streaked face to Alara, who was quietly watching the scholars debate over her family's legacy. A gift like that cannot be allowed to wither. I want to offer Alara a full scholarship to the university's preparatory program, starting immediately. And for you, Mrs. She paused, looking at Maria's cleaner's uniform with distaste. I believe the university library has an opening in its archival department. The work would be less strenuous. And the pay, significantly better. The reward was not just money or opportunity. It was dignity. It was a future. It was the vindication of a quiet, hidden genius and the honor of a forgotten soldier, finally brought into the light. 6 months later, the scent of old paper and leather was Alara's new normal. She sat at a heavy oak table in the university's rare books archive, a place that felt more like home than her old apartment ever had. Sunlight streamed through a tall, arched window, illuminating the dust motes she had once resembled. Beside her, resting on the polished wood, were her great-grandfather's dog tags, their metallic gleam a constant, comforting presence. She was no longer a ghost in the halls of the wealthy. She was a valued consultant, the youngest in the university's history. Professors with decades of experience would bring her texts, not to test her, but to genuinely ask for her insight. She was helping them build a new dictionary of lost tongues, the informal, Creole languages of soldiers, merchants, and exiles throughout history. Across the room, Maria was carefully cataloging a collection of 19th-century letters, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had enrolled in night classes, studying history. The fear that had lived in her eyes for so long had been replaced by a quiet confidence. She no longer walked with her head down, trying to be invisible. She was a scholar in training, a mother whose pride was a tangible, radiant force. There was news, sometimes, of Alastair Finch. After the disastrous evening at his home, his funding had been pulled by donors who felt he'd been made a fool. His reputation shattered, he had resigned from his university post and retreated into private life. A recent article mentioned he was traveling in remote mountain regions, reportedly trying to learn a dialect from a secluded tribe. Some called it a desperate attempt to regain credibility. Ilara hoped it was a lesson in humility. She looked down at the new manuscript before her, its script a beautiful, flowing puzzle. She closed her eyes, listening for the silence between the symbols, for the echo of the hand that wrote them. Every language is a house, her great-grandfather's voice whispered in her memory. You just have to find the key, and for the first time, Ilara Vance knew, with absolute certainty, that she held the keys to them all.